Shalom and welcome. This episode will cover the question, what is Abraham and the ancient Israelites' Y DNA haplogroup? We will specifically speak from the perspective of the paternal descendants of Abraham, because I'm aware that other lineages and haplogroups could have been among the Israelites, but for this video our main goal is to look for the direct bloodline lineage of Abraham and his descendants. What will be their haplogroup? With that being said, what is a Y DNA haplogroup? A Y chromosome is passed down from father to son. According to livingdna.com, titled "What are haplogroups?" it reads, "The paternal haplogroup relates to your Y chromosome, and since that is a sex-determining chromosome for men, it is passed down from father to son." This is the perfect tool to use when trying to determine paternal lineages. Therefore, if we're looking for the Y DNA of Abraham and his descendants, we have to use haplogroups. Abraham's Y chromosome would have been passed down to his son Isaac, to his grandson Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, and then the Israelites themselves, who paternally descend from Abraham and will carry his Y DNA haplogroup. With that being said, let's look at the first and one of the best candidates, in my opinion, for Abraham and the Israelites' Y DNA haplogroup. One candidate for Abraham and the Israelites is E-M34. One method we can use to determine the haplogroup of Abraham and therefore the Israelites is by looking at the origin of the subclade and the location for the origin of Semites. One subclade of haplogroup E that Abraham could have been is a downstream of E-M34. E-M34 is a downstream of E-M123 and E-Z830, which the Natufians carried. According to the genetic analysis done on 6 Natufian remains from northern Israel, the Natufians carried the Y DNA haplogroup E-Z830, a somewhat upwind clade of E-M123, and therefore ancestral to it. The Natufians were one of the first settled peoples in the world and may have contributed to the domestication of certain crops and thus the advent of agriculture. The discovery of E-Z830 without other clades suggests an indigenous presence in Canaan and Israel and predates all other clades, which are not known to have existed in the region at the time, 10,000 years before present. E-M123 is thought to have a TMRCA about 18,000 years ago, 8,000 years before the Natufian, possibly ancestral, remains are from. Haplogroup E1B1B2 has been found in 75% of the Angazelle population, along with 60% of PPNB populations circa 8,800 through 6,500 BC. And according to the book titled "In Hot Pursuit of Language and Prehistory," it reads, "This paper makes an additional inference, since there is archaeological and physical anthropological reason to believe that the Natufians were related to modern Semitic-speaking peoples of the Levant." And according to Cambridge University, it reads, "Given the modern distribution of Semitic languages over the area in question, which belong to the larger Afro-Asiatic family, it seems appropriate to suggest that these first farmers of the Levant and their Mesolithic predecessors, including the Natufian culture, were speaking a Proto-Afro-Asiatic language. It may be that Proto-Semitic continued to develop within the Levant and Syria area, since both Ebilites and Akkadian, early Semitic languages, are there attested early, the former around 2400 BC. Furthermore, M34 has its origin in the Levant being the origin and homeland of Proto-Semites. According to the webpage Eupedia titled "Haplogroup E1B1B," it reads, "Origin and History, E-M123 originated some 19,000 years ago during the last Ice Age. Its place of origin is uncertain, but it was probably in the Red Sea region, somewhere between the southern Levant and Ethiopia. Its main subclade, E-M34, most probably emerged in the Levant about 15,000 years ago. Soon afterwards, M34 split into two branches, M84 and Z841, which were probably found in the Fertile Crescent during the Neolithic period. According to the paper titled Bayesian Phylogenetic Analysis of Semitic Languages Identifies an Early Bronze Age Origin of Semitic in the Near East, it reads, "We estimate that Semitic had an early Bronze Age origin approximately 5,750 years before present in the Levant, followed by an expansion of Akkadian into Mesopotamia." So as we can see, we have an expansion of Semites from the Levant going into Mesopotamia. But we also see that E markers were heavily abundant in the Levant in the period where Semites were. It's highly likely that these E markers are the Semites and that Semitic populations carried haplogroup E into Mesopotamia. According to the webpage Eupedia titled E1B1B, it reads, E-M34 lineages experience a much more dramatic expansion during the Chalcolithic Copper Age period. Also, downstream of CTS 1096 and Y14891 and Z21018 clades are typically found among people of Jewish ancestry, while PF6391 and Z21421 are found in the Levant, the Syria, Lebanon, Palestine, Jordan, and the Arabian Peninsula. F1382 appears to have expanded during the Iron Age from the Levant to the Arabian Peninsula, where it is almost exclusively found today. And in this time period of the early Bronze Age, we can find many E-M34 samples throughout the Middle East, such as in the Levant and Syria near Ebla, which was an ancient Semitic kingdom. They were an Eastern Semitic speaking people, but also in Anatolia. Could Abraham also be one of these Semitic populations with E-M34? This is actually a high probability. According to the paper titled Haplogroups M34 and M84 among Jews, could Abraham be E1B1B1C1 or E1B1B1C1A? The present paper clarifies the TMRCA, the most common recent ancestor of the Jews of haplogroup E1B1B1C1, the origin of Jews of haplogroup M84, and answer the question, could Abraham be M34 or M84? The specific structure of Jewish sample of haplogroup E1B1B1C1, the vast majority of the haplotypes belong to one cluster, makes the TMRCA very sensitive to including of any new haplotype not belonging to that cluster. Due to the instability of the TMRCA of the Jewish E1B1C1, the authors emphasize the importance of the confidence interval calculated by 95% probability. Also, the origin of Jews of haplogroup M84, which has the largest number of clusters, has not been adequately studied so far. In addition, the simultaneous presence of M34 subclades among the Jews and Arabs contribute to the assumption of belonging Y chromosomal Abraham, a conditional common ancestor of the Arabs and Jews, in one of these subclades. The question of the lifetime of common ancestors of Jews and Arabs of haplogroups E1B1C1 and E1B1C1A has not been studied yet. The aim of this paper is to clarify the TMRCA of the Jews of haplogroup E1B1C1, the origin of Jews of haplogroup M84, and answer the question, could Abraham be M34 or M84? The most common ancestors of Jews of E1B1C1 and E1B1C1A. For our research, we will use Jewish E1B1C1 haplotypes from Haplozone E-M34 database. The calculation according to the algorithm shows that the recent common ancestor of the sample lived 5,650 plus or minus 2,820 years ago, with the probability of 95%. To determine the team RCA of Jews of haplogroup E-M34, we use haplotypes of the Jewish clusters E1b1b1c1a-A, E1b1b1c1a-B, E1b1b1c1a-C from haplozone E-M35 database. Our calculation shows that the TMRCA of the sample is 4,100 plus or minus 1,740 years with 95% probability. At the time of writing the paper, July 2010, in Sharif DNA Project and Cohen DNA Project, there were 3 haplotypes of E1b1b1c1a Saids and 2 haplotypes of E1b1b1c1 Cohens, as well as dozens of Arabian and Jewish E1b1c1a and E1b1c1 haplotypes. Haplotypes of E1b1c1 Saids and E1b1c1a Cohens are not yet available. The TMRCAs of Arabian and Jewish E1b1c1 and E1b1c1a are 8,080 plus or minus 3,890 and 4,080 plus or minus 1,440 years ago. Consequently, the Jewish and Arabian lines of E1b1c1 divided one from the other several thousands of years before biblical Abraham. On the other hand, the common ancestor of the Jewish and Arabian E1b1c1a lived in the same historical era as the biblical Abraham. The result demonstrates the close affinity of Jewish and Arabian E1b1c1a. The TMRCA of E1b1c1a Saids is 4,080 plus or minus 1,560 years ago. That more than thousands of years over the era of Ali and excludes their Said origin. Conclusions. 1. Subclades E1b1c1 and E1b1c1a were included in Jewish community during the conquest of Canaan. With 95% probability, the TMRCA of Jewish E1b1c1 and E1b1c1a are 5,650 plus or minus 2,820 and 4,100 plus or minus 1,740 years. 2. Subclades E1b1c1 and E1b1c1a, both found among Jews and Arabs, including a small number of Cohens and Saids. The calculated TMRCAs show that the most recent E1b1c1 ancestor of Arabs and Jews lived 8,080 plus or minus 3,890 years ago, and the most recent E1b1c1a ancestor of Arabs and Jews lived 4,080 plus or minus 1,440 years ago. The most recent common ancestor of E1b1c1a Said lived 4,080 plus or minus 1,560 years ago. The most recent common ancestor of E1b1c1 Cohens lived 440 plus or minus 410 years ago. 3. TMRCA calculations show that according to formal characteristics, subclades E1b1c1 cannot claim to be the Abraham's haplogroup. 4. The most recent common ancestor of the Jewish and Arabian E1b1c1a lived in the same historical era as the biblical Abraham, but a contradiction of the calculated TMRCA of Cohens and Saids to historical data exclude haplogroup E1b1c1a from the contenders of the role of Abraham's haplogroup. Despite this, the results indicate close relationship of Jewish and Arabian E1b1c1a lines. By the way, when it mentioned Saids having E-M34 and E-M84 that's related to the Jews, a Said is a honorific title denoting people accepted as descendants of the Islamic prophet Abraham through his grandson Hassan ibn Ali and Hassan ibn Ali, sons of Abraham's daughter Fatima and his cousin and son-in-law Ali. And according to Britannica, Said, Arabic title of respect sometimes restricted as is the title Sharf in the Banu Hashim, members of Muhammad's clan in particular the descendants of Muhammad's uncle Al-Abbasa and Abu Talib, and of Ali ibn Abi Talib. By Muhammad's daughter Fatima in the Hijaz, Sa'id is further restricted to the descendants of Hassan, the younger son of Ali and Fatima. Also, Sharfs were mentioned as having E-M34 and E-M84 in the paper and being related to the Jews. A Sharf is a term used to designate a person, descendant, or claiming to be descendant from the family of the Islamic prophet Muhammad. In the broader sense, it refers to any descendant of Abraham's great-grandfather Hasim, the Benu Hasim or Hasimites, already in Muhammad's day an established clan within the Meccan tribe of the Quraysh, including all descendants of Muhammad's paternal uncles Abu Talib and Al-Abbasa. More often, it refers to a descendant of Ali, a son of Abu Talib, and a paternal cousin of Muhammad, especially not exclusively through Ali's marriage with Muhammad's daughter Fatima. In its narrowest sense, it refers only to someone who descends from Ali and Fatima's eldest son and Muhammad's grandson Hassan. And according to Britannica.com, Sharif, Arabic title of respect restricted after the advent of Islam to members of Muhammad's clan of Hasim, in particular to descendants of his uncle Abi Abbas and Abu Talib, and of the latter's son Ali by Muhammad's daughter Fatima. In the Hijaz, the title of Sharifs is said to have been further restricted to the descendants of Hassan, the elder son of Ali and Fatima. Sharifs originally were heads of prominent families in a town. Therefore, according to the family tree of the Safavids and the Sa'ids, and they are related to the Jews, and both the Jews and these Arabs carry E-M34 and 84, and of course both Jews and Arabs have a tradition of descending from Abraham, and there just so happens to be a subclade of haplogroup E that both the Arabs and the Jews descend from that was in the Bronze Age when Abraham would have lived. Could this subclade of E be Abraham? But let's continue reading. According to the paper titled "How Did So Much Middle Eastern DNA Get to Wales?" examining 3 possible sources: Carthaginians, Romans, English Jews. And it reads, E-M34 is prevalent among Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, as well as among Ethiopians. That both Ashkenazic and Sephardic Jews carry this haplotype indicates that it entered the Levantine Jewish community early on, and then spread outward as Jews split into Sephardic and Ashkenazic lineages. According to Family Tree DNA titled E-Y6923 Jewish haplogroup, it reads, "This project is for men who have done Y DNA testing, and their terminal haplogroup designation by Family Tree DNA will be either E-Y6923 or one of its downstream branches, E-L791, or it will be predicted E-M35 or E-M34. With Y matches who are E-Y6923 and /or E-L791. The Y6923 SMP is found downstream of E-L791 and likely occurred about 1,700 to 1,600 years ago. Its main Ashkenazi branch, defined by E-Y6940, dates to about 1,250 to 1,100 years ago. It seems to have been one of the major founding branches of early Ashkenazi community. Other branches which have been found in Libyan Jews, Algerian Jews, Tunisian Jews, Greek Jews, Sicilians, Puerto Ricans, New Mexicans, Peruvians, Moselle Germans, and French Canadians include E-Y102667, E-FT227227, E-FT405052, and one yet unnamed branch. Clearly, E-M34 is among Jewish populations, but let's look deeper into Arabian populations that carry E-M34. According to the paper titled Arabian Clusters of Haplogroup M34, it reads, haplogroup M34 and its subclade M84 were detected among the Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula. A possible reason for migration of the founder of cluster E1B1B1C1A-E from the Levant to the Arabian Peninsula could be the Crusades. The highest diversity of subclades of haplogroup M34 is observed in the Levant and Anatolia. Therefore, its ancestral home is often placed in the eastern Mediterranean. In addition, haplogroup M34 and its subclade M84 were detected among the Arabs in the Arabian Peninsula, where they form specific clusters E1B1C1-B and E1B1C1A-E. Knowing the age of the clusters and their area of distribution, we can find the history of clusters' origin and resettlement of their carriers. In this paper, we will try to find out the history of E1B1C1 and E1B1C1A subclades in the Arabian Peninsula on the example of these clusters. The sample of cluster E1B1C1A-E consists of 567 marker haplotypes. This cluster TMRCA is 1090 plus minus 510 years. Despite the fact, due to different sizes of samples, the ages of these clusters' founders are different. It should examine the entire period of their confidence intervals, which are intersected. It is possible that both clusters have arisen in about the same medieval era and are linked to the migration of their founders from the Levant to the Arabian Peninsula, according to some important event. What could have caused this migration? We think that a possible cause of the medieval migrations from the Levant could be the Crusades, a series of Western invasions to oust the Muslims from Palestine, which lasted almost 200 years, 1096 through 1272 years. The First Crusade ended with the capture of Jerusalem and the massacre of Muslims. Apparently, these invasions, and as a result of them, looting and killing, forced part of the Muslims to seek refuge from persecution of the Crusaders closer to Mecca. This, in our view, could cause to arise at least one cluster of Arabia E1B1C1A-E. Conclusion: 1. Carriers of subclades M34 and M84 identified in the Arabian Peninsula, where they form clusters E1B1C1-B and E1B1C1A-E. 2. The TMRCA of cluster E1B1C1-B is 50 plus or minus 320 years ago. The TMRCA of cluster E1B1C1A-E is 1090 plus or minus 510 years ago. They possibly arose at one time. 3. A possible reason for migration of the founder of cluster E1B1C1A-E from the Levant to the Arabian Peninsula could be the Crusades. With all of that being said, we can find a very high distribution of E-M34 in the Arabian Peninsula. It represents at around 25 to 50% in Yemenites as an example. If you take a look at Weifel.com and type in E-M34, you can see a high percentage of this haplogroup within the Arabian Peninsula, as well as other parts of the Middle East and the Mediterranean. Also, if you type in Y heat map E-M34, you see a high distribution within the Arabian Peninsula, other parts of the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. Also, if you take a look at S&P tracker and type in E-M34, you'll see a high distribution in the Arabian Peninsula as well as in other parts of the Middle East and the Mediterranean, and it seems that the split would have took place in the Levant, with groups of Semites going into the Middle East of Arabia and other groups of Semites staying in the Levant and others expanding to the Mediterranean and Europe. With that being said, I will say that E-M34 is a great candidate for Abraham and the Israelites.